Hello, friends. Today we're going to talk about Cuba.
Ah, yes. Cuba, a nation that has undergone much change, especially since 1902.
1902 began a very tumultuous period for Cuba because the person in charge of the country was constantly changing.
There was also presidential elections, except the rules weren't always being followed.
Right. Like in 1906 when Thomas Palma was in charge.
And then, some military veterans led a revolt against him and his extremely weak government.
This resulted, 2 years later, in another leader, Jose Gomez, being elected.
But then, hey, guess what? 2 years after that, there was another attempted overthrow, resulting in many casualties.
Finally, in 1924, General Mercado was elected, and the government was actually stable for a while.
Exactly. It was actually super beneficial to the economy, too, because of tourism.
In 1952, however, Fulgencio Batista staged a coup and publicly outlawed the Communist Party.
Here's where Castro comes in. Castro. He had begun contact with the USSR in 1943.
Batista's anti-communist ideals gained him much support from the U.S.
But Castro decided he didn't like that and tried to overthrow Batista.
And drumroll, please. We have the takeover.
This was a military takeover, where Castro basically employed non-stop guerrilla warfare tactics, and was basically attacking full force the entire time, without much restriction.
It was super, super messy, full of bombings and house raids and human rights violations.
Oh, here's a fun fact for you guys. Alright, all of Castro's forces had like really thick beards. This helped identify them as well as unify them, and also to deter spies, as enemies would have to start preparing, like, to become one of them months in advance because they'd have to wait until they had a full face of hair.
And so, over time, Batista's military forces began to fail. He tried to combat Castro's warfare with Operation Verano, but it didn't really work.
Spoiler alert! Castro wins.
Now, at this time, the U.S. begins to recognize that Batista was losing, but they did not support Castro.
So the U.S. decided to back up the military leader, Eulogio Cantillo, instead.
Castro thought that he and Cantillo would have an alliance after the war ended, but Cantillo ended up double-crossing Castro and stayed aligned with Batista.
So Castro publicly denounced Cantillo and officially came to power in 1959.
Communism survived in this country basically for as long as Castro was in power.
There was a short time in 2006 when Castro stepped down for a bit.
But don't worry, he was still head of the Communist Party in Cuba and had full control of the military.
This takeover was more of a civil war in that sense, in the sense that it wasn't done it wasn't done on orders from the USSR.
Castro was aligned with the USSR and some of their satellite states, and what he did worked out in their favor, but it was done for Cuba in his eyes.
Castro took everything a step further by publicly denouncing the U.S. as an ally and breaking off all communication with them, while also publicly announcing his amicable relationship with the USSR.
And Castro promised to introduce major reforms in Cuba.
This included reducing illiteracy, improving healthcare, and reducing crime. Here's an example of some propaganda. It says, "Fight against the impossible and win."
Mm. Oh, and of course, end American capitalist domination. But I mean, hey, who doesn't have that on their to-do list, right?
Amidst his work within Cuba, Castro also worked with the USSR leader Khrushchev. In fact, they had a fantastic relationship.
Khrushchev wanted to put missiles in Cuba to help strengthen their country.
Because nothing says strength like giant nuclear weapons.
Of course.
Yes.
And Khrushchev also invited Castro to the USSR, which Castro considered a very high honor.
Speaking of high honors, while Castro was there, he was given the Order of Lenin.
Wow, congrats, Castro.
Yeah, don't know what that is, but it sounds awesome.
Unfortunately, his relationship with Gorbachev was slightly less awesome, as Gorbachev, during this time of power, slowly reduced the aid that was given to Cuba and sort of left them to fend for themselves.
As far as American leaders go, Castro didn't have a great friendship going on with Mr. President Kennedy, who believed that he should support Cuban exiles who didn't support Castro.
I'm coming!
Well,
Bloopers. So, still recording.
it's about that Cuban coffee, huh? It's good stuff.
So, we may have to...
We'll cut that out. It's okay. We'll cut that out.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
Where were we?
Alright. He wanted to train them in guerrilla warfare tactics in the Bay of Pigs operation. Unfortunately, this failed miserably as the exiles surrendered in less than a day.
Kennedy was also in office during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Which caused a U.S. military blockade to prevent the Soviets from providing Cuba with any sort of military aid.
President Johnson kept an eye on Cuba while in office, while President Nixon turned his attention completely away from Cuba and onto Vietnam.
President Ford tried to improve relations with Cuba, and so did President Carter, enough so that Castro let some Cubans immigrate to America, and 100,000 of them did.
In President Reagan's time, no more Cuban citizens were allowed in, and relationships haven't really improved since.
So that's Cuba.
Lots of political turmoil.
And communism.